welcome early birds. We'll make a bit of a start. It's nice to see you here, and it's nice to be here to talk about the RASE's Farm of the Future report, which was published back in March, and which we're going to present you a few slides on here today with some of the authors of the report and editors, and then featuring one of the companies that we provided a case study for in the report, which is a small robot company. The aim of the report, which we produced over the last year, in fact, we were just starting on the report at last year's Groundswell, was to give farmers a vision of where they can, what they can do and where they need to get to between now and 2030, and a vision for what is required. And indeed, you know, if people have already started on their journey to decarbonisation, some of the things they might embrace. And for those farmers that are still thinking about it, trying to give them some ideas of what is possible and what is achievable. And the report is a collaboration between the Royal Agricultural Society and their sister charity, Innovation for Agriculture. And on your seat, there is a report from Innovation for Agriculture looking at immediate actions and things that can be part of a decarbonisation plan. And the Farm of the Future report is more about, you know, once you've started, where the technologies are going to go in the future, and what is actually out there, because any transition to decarbonisation between now and 2030 is going to be based on existing or evolving technology rather than something coming like a bolt of lightning over the horizon. You know, we need to remember that farmers primarily are food producers, and I think that never needs to be forgotten in anything that is involving a debate or a discussion about decarbonisation. But we are talking about system change. And one of the quotes from the report, which I think is absolutely brilliant, is that, you know, farmers can't be green if they're in the red. We need to be a profitable business to make the investment that is going to be required over the next 7 years and beyond. And as part of that, we need more events on farm, whether they're demonstration events or indeed, you know, this brilliant show here at Groundswell, to give people a chance to talk to the technology providers and see things being demonstrated. The report itself had about 30 authors and collaborators. There are a few here in the audience, and was really tries to act as a compendium of the different technologies and the different ideas and concepts that people need to embrace. And it covers soil health, agri-tech, energy on farms, and fuels of the future. We had a tribute yesterday to Caroline Drummond, and she wrote a small thought piece for the report, which I've got up here on the slide, because I think it totally embraces what we as an industry, and indeed the report, is trying to achieve. And, you know, we are a global farming system, and we need to take action, but we need to work independently. And in a sense, there's going to be a spectrum of ideas and activities that individual farmers are going to take up. But we need ambition, we need leadership, and, you know, just a sort of observation, we can't expect all that leadership to come from government. That leadership has to come from within the industry and from within organisations like RAISE, IFA, Groundswell. And, you know, if now is the time to change, we need to see a sort of step up in the level of support from government, but we can't wait for government to catch up with what industry leaders are doing. And two of the industry leaders that I'd like to just highlight here are White Farms in Somerset and Brewdog in Scotland, both of which are embarking on a total, or have embarked on and are nearly completing a decarbonisation programme for their businesses, but they are now both looking at Scope 3 emissions and the decarbonisation of their supply chain. And it's going to be, a lot of it's going to be led by our customers, but farmers need to be part of that change, not dragged along behind. We need to be actually looking at the ways in which farmers can generate value from the transition. You know, we have to combine food security with action on emissions, but we can't forget that in the current crisis with energy and food being an issue globally, that, you know, the landscape is changing, and that gives opportunities as well as providing threats. We are, I think, moving on to a period of time where we need to see more action on carbon calculation, carbon footprinting, and it was very interesting to hear a speaker from Northern Ireland talking yesterday about having every farm given a base load calculation for their carbon emissions so people can calculate what they're doing forward. But without further ado, let's press on to hear from our speakers. Our first speaker is the main lead editor of the Farm of the Future report, Angie Bywater.
Good morning. Probably about 10 years ago, we looked at anaerobic digestion on small farms. And that was sort of part of the beginning of the journey where we thought we would spread the scope a little bit wider, as Richard said, to across the piece. And at the time, I had said something about, they often say that farming is the art of turning fossil fuels into food. So was true then, and in many ways it's still true now, although there's been huge changes in those last 10 years. But nevertheless, a lot of what we're trying to do here is fueled by various types of fuel. So we thought we'd have a look at what sort of things might be coming along in terms of energy. We all need fuel for the equipment out there. We need heating for our homes. We need and farm buildings. And decarbonizing that in a rural area, particularly off gas grids or whatever they decide to do with the gas grids, is quite a challenge. So quite a busy slide here. These are available on the RSE website. But if I just sort of generally talk through some of the things we looked at. For decarbonizing heat, because a lot of rural areas off the gas grid are on really high carbon fuels, every time a rural property on the gas grid gets off of those high carbon fuels for heating, it makes a bigger difference than, say, somebody in the urban area on gas who's electrifying. So, but with the benefit of space, I suppose farms have the option of potentially ground source heat pumps, water source heat pumps potentially, and of course air source heat pumps, which is probably going to be one of the options for urban properties. Solar thermal is one that has really been underrated, and there are lots of interesting models coming up where if you can imagine just energy flowing around the farm, there are models where you can, say, get heat into something with solar thermal. If you've got excess PV, for example, you can add extra energy via electrics. So there's a lot of different ways you can spin these once you start getting these technologies available. And over the past few years, we've seen a lot of people adopt solar, particularly, and biomass. Solar PV, again, has been what I call it the gateway drug to farm electrification. I think we've got Stephen Temple here, and he's quite unusual in that he's used anaerobic digestion as his gateway drug to electrification. In other words, over a period of time, because you're producing your own energy, you're starting, we all don't have huge endless amounts of money, but you're starting to be able to electrify things more. So I think he's got an electric loader there. He's gone to electric cars. When the diesel pumps have given out, he's gone to electric pumps and things like that. So we're able to, people, when they're having that kind of conversations, we're able to electrify things or use different fuel sources. Solar PV has been really interesting because we were talking about this. Where we were looking at panels of, say, 250 watts before, we're now looking at the average panel being about 400 watts, which is quite a game changer. But even recently, they've revealed panels as much as 700 watts. Now, of course, we all know that the sun doesn't shine every day, and the wind doesn't blow. So it does help to have battery storage. And again, probably over the last 5 years, we've started to see battery storage become more prevalent. And that's everything from small batteries straight through to massive batteries, or even farms hosting grid-scale batteries for grid balancing. So there are certain opportunities there that are possible for farms. Anaerobic digestion, some really interesting things there. We've had large digesters. We're still fomenting for smaller digesters, smaller, what I would call farm-appropriate digesters. And for those of you who don't have a sort of a history of that background, the 2011 RAISE report talked about really small farm digesters where they just use the cow slurry to run an Auga or a Rayburn or something like that. So it's not that the technology is not scalable, it's just that it's been much harder to make those stack up. But certainly against a background of high energy prices, and high energy prices that are probably going to be continuing, certainly the IEA is looking at this continuing for at least another 5 years. That starts to become a really interesting prospect, using those own resources on farm for what you need it for, rather than, which is still an option, as a potential major, massive scale, farm diversification operation. Use it as another piece of agricultural equipment. Some of the interesting work going on around that is, obviously you can make electricity through what they call a combined heat and power plant. You can make vehicle fuel, and you can make that off-grid. You can upgrade to vehicle fuel. So options are there. Economics, still, the jury's out. But we've got some really interesting companies coming along in that space. The right-hand picture shows on-farm wind, and this has been, the CCC, the Climate Change Committee said, right, we've got to have some more onshore wind. It hasn't been the flavor of the month, but actually it works really well because often when the sun doesn't shine, the wind is blowing. And we add a bit of battery storage to that, and it starts, again, become quite an interesting option for the farm to generate and use its own electricity. And of course, it makes much more sense to maximize your energy use. And when you're on the farm, the other choice you have is you're able to shift your demand. So with a lot of these technologies, I use something as simple as smart plugs and Alexa to shift my demand at a household level. And this is something that is quite simple, accessible, and available to people now. I've talked about the power battery storage. The other part I wanted to just quickly mention is the data side behind this. So as we start producing our own energy, we've started to see interesting data aggregation things. So because energy is just a piece of data to somebody, if you're exporting energy, suddenly we've seen groups of people come together, or companies that aggregate energy produced by groups of people, to create some really interesting sort of buying and selling power for those people. So although you might not be making huge amounts, aggregated, you do have a bit of buying power, and that's the farmer cooperative model for energy, if you like. And there's some other people talking about blockchain and all of those sorts of things with energy in the same thing, and we saw some of that last week at a trade show. That's a space to watch, slightly beyond my pay grade, but certainly a place to watch. Time of use tariffs. We've got people like Octopus and with their agile tariff saying, well, actually, if you're going to use electricity at expensive times, we're going to charge you a lot more. But conversely, if you're an electricity producer, that also provides opportunities for you to produce more and export to the grid during those sorts of times. Another interesting place to watch is what we would call the gaseous fuels, which of course the biomethane or biogas from AD falls into, but hydrogen falls into that. So we are looking at possibly small-scale electrolyzers occurring. So if farms can produce hydrogen, that can bizarrely go straight into an anaerobic digester to produce more methane, or it can be used as its own energy source. And this, with government policy looking at hydrogen as a whole, I think is going to be another interesting place to watch. So that's my little piece on possibly the future of energy. And I'll pass on to Mike.
Thanks, Angie. Mike is one of the other co-editors of the RASE report, and he's going to pick up on the farm fuels topic. One of the reasons we produced these graphics was to provide a way of demonstrating the range of technology options that are out there, ranging from the soil science side of things. There are three of these infographics, one on soils, one on energy, and this one on future fuels. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Richard, and morning, everyone. As this is the Glastonbury of farming, I think we rate that at. Some of us will be whizzing down to do the other one in a minute. So I didn't bring my guitar this morning, so if that's okay. But the other thing is actually at Glastonbury, things don't kick off until about 11, 12 o'clock for obvious reasons, so it's good to see you all turn up this morning at 9. We didn't think there'd be anybody here, so that's the thing. I think Henry's given a really good description there of the farm as a power station. Now, we could argue that on our farms, my family farm, it's been a power station all its life. We've always been growing biomass, we've always been using the wood, we've had the Arga burner and all those kind of things there. So, but I think going forward, the farm as a power station has got an awful lot to offer, not just to the farm, but also to the surrounding rural communities and to the grids themselves. So the idea of farming energy as an alternative enterprise as well as food goes hand in hand, in our opinion. But I think the target should be to actually be self-sufficient or move towards level of self-sufficiency as much as we can. My job today is to talk about the farm as possibly a fueling station. So the idea that a farm can actually produce its own transport fuel in the future, both for itself and actually then also possibly for other users. About 10 years ago, I was in Sweden, and the farms were producing biogas, upgrading to biomethane, and then having a fuel station. I don't think I've got a slide of it today, but a fuel station on the farm, and the local village were coming in and filling up with their biomethane and driving off. Now, I know there's legislation that probably prevents that at the moment here, but the principle in rural areas particularly of farms being fuel providers as well as energy providers is really quite interesting. In 2014, the second report that the Royal Agricultural Society produced, and I think we've got to give them credit for continually wanting to fund these kind of forward-looking reports. The first one was the anaerobic digestion program that Angie prepared. And then in 2014, actually, the three of us, three musketeers, came together to produce what was called the Refueling of the Countryside. We thought the title was quite nice, Refueling the Countryside, for all kinds of reasons. But at that time, we were looking at things like biomethane tractors and looking at battery-powered vehicles and so on. Really innovative stuff, 2014. Not a lot's happened, we have to say. I run a company called Greenwatt Technology, and we've been really providing energy consulting for rural systems, farmers and industry as well. And to be honest, we didn't expect to still be kind of doing the same kind of things we're doing today. We didn't expect that 10 years ago. We thought it would become mainstream and everything. It hasn't become mainstream. Things are starting to now. Electric vehicles, electric cars. Some of you have come in hybrids or fully battery electric cars today. It's starting to tip. And I think somebody mentioned, I was talking to Sam earlier on, we're actually at a tipping point now of innovation and technology starting to happen. And that's about the capability to integrate all these things, and particularly with data. And I know that here there are a lot of people who actually have got really no background in farming whatsoever, but by golly, they've got a background in data. And that's suddenly starting to be really interesting in going forward. So Refueling the Countryside, a good story, some really good case studies. White Farms featured quite heavily in it at that time, and it's still available. It's a good read, and it's interesting to say, well, we told you so, but we didn't quite get to that level of criticism. We were asked then by the Royal Agricultural Society to come together with Innovation for Agriculture to extend the 2014 report now on 2022. And look forward to, obviously, with net zero and zero carbon and so on has all come in since that. That was not mentioned in the 2014 report, of course, and now, of course, it's everywhere in climate emergency that we all know about. So we were asked to broaden that scope, and okay, we know a little bit between us, but actually there are people who contributed to the report who know a lot more in specialist areas, and I think the ability to bring in those specialist authors into which we'll hear two of them in a moment, really has added tremendous value to this report. But of course, the bigger you make a report, the bigger it becomes, and the heavier it becomes, the weightier it becomes. So it's now resulted in 6 booklets, I think, of which that's the main one over there, and then there's one. And as Richard showed, there's one covering arable, and it's covering the energy and soils in particular. So my job was really to coordinate the transport, and so we've produced one called Decarbonising Farm Vehicles and Future Fuels. So that's a standalone document, which is also obviously incorporated into the main report in a briefer format. The experts came into that were Jonathan Wheeler of Wheeler Woodhouse, who's a well-known journalist, really, farming journalist, particularly focusing on transport and fuels, and also Cenex, who are based at Loughborough. Some of you know the LCV, or Low Carbon Vehicle Show, that's down at Millbrook, not far away from here. That's in September again this year, which has been, I think it's now in its 14th year. It's a fantastic opportunity to drive alternative vehicles, and I've driven sports cars, I've driven lorries, I've driven buses, and I have no special license to do it at all, but you can do it on those days, by the way, there. Anyway, they've always had an interest. They actually did support the 2014 report as well, because they're interested in the future of transport. They were set up originally by government and now are an independent consultancy and research organisation. But Nick McCarthy and Keith Budden of Cenex were major contributors to this. And part of the report actually is quite a technical report into comparing and contrasting the different fuels that can be used. So I better keep an eye on time because Richard's got his watch out. But thank you. I won't go through any more of that detail there. That's to look at. I do often think of these things and saying, well, the small print's so small you can't read the darn thing, and actually, therefore, does it mean anything? When you get this either online, and that's when it's all there, then there's QR codes and everything on the little cards on your seats in there, do have a look at them and take it in bite-sized chunks rather than trying to read a whole report. So let's have a look at a few of the drivers of change. I don't need to tell most of you this. I looked at the global fuel security and fossil fuel prices. I looked at diesel price this morning, red diesel price. It's 116, I think, this morning. I think it was 45p last year at the same date. So quite a considerable change there. Is it going to go down much? I don't know. Once it's broken through ceilings, obviously it's a bit like fuel prices on the pump stations, isn't it? We will never go back to £1.25, and that seemed expensive, didn't it, at the time? So I filled up yesterday. Sadly, I had to come in the diesel car because of my mileage on the electric car, but I paid £1.99 for my litre of diesel. So we know that's going to happen. Where the graph goes, who knows? Where it'll settle out to, who knows? But it's certainly not going to get any easier on that line there. Climate emergency is serious, and we all know that. It isn't just somebody standing on a podium saying we've all got to look after our environment. Every council in the country has now produced a climate emergency action plan, and I think every business, or lots of businesses, are starting to do that. Major businesses, some of the top 100 businesses, like Mars and L'Oreal and people like that, are starting to produce their strategies. We as our farm businesses should be doing that as well. And if you haven't got one, it's perhaps an idea to start thinking about that and saying, well, how can we on our farm business start to actually reduce carbon and move towards net zero? As Richard said, we've all got to do it individually as well as collectively. Consumer demand is changing really fast, and that's not just being driven by the supermarkets. People are getting educated, and particularly the younger buyers are driving that kind of change. You know, they want food, we want food produced properly, sustainably, without damaging the environment, cheaply. You know, nobody wants to pay lots of money for the food, but how cheap is cheap from there? And it was interesting listening to Mr. Dimbleby yesterday about the food report, and actually how much of that will actually go through properly through there. So, red diesel. I want to spend a bit of time on red diesel. Richard, give me a minute to be able to do this, please, because I think it's a really serious issue. We've dug our head in the sand. We've been paying red diesel for all my lifetime. I won't say how many years, but it's a long time, many decades. and diesel's been there. It's been cheap, it's been subsidised and taxed. We know that farming is the only sector at the moment that's still allowed to get the red diesel subsidy. My question is, how long will that last? And the other question is, how long should that last? Because our consumers will start to say, look, you guys, you're continuing to use red diesel because it's subsidised by the government. And at what point then do we actually move from, 116, 115 pence up to 199 or whatever price you can actually deal with? So that is going to change, whether it happened before 2030 or close to 2030 or whatever, but it won't be long before that changes. It'll be interesting to listen to government and George Eustace this afternoon and see whether he hints at anything in there. But it's not going to stay. Therefore, we've got to get prepared for that. That's good because we will move from fossil fuels onto sustainable fuels. The other areas in there will be talked about later on, soil health and government legislation under environmental land management and obviously the technologies. It's the left-hand side that I want to finish with, and that's on the solutions. The book is full of solutions, or the report is full of solutions, and to be honest, we could sit down and write another report tomorrow that actually is full of another set of solutions. There's so many things going on. The interesting thing is, most of those things going on are not going on in farming, they're going on in other sectors, in other industries. And I'm actually fascinated by the technology that what I call the 20 to 40-year-olds, sorry for anybody over 40, but are bringing to the table. And I'm getting calls now from companies who say, I wonder if this could apply to farming. I wonder if this could apply to food. Could we transfer this? Can we have a discussion with somebody to be able to see where that happens? So outsiders are starting to look at farming as a niche area. This is a fantastic place to do trials and set up. You can make things happen. If somebody wants to put a trial on a farm, you don't go to the council or the DEFRA or whatever permission. You just go to the farmer and say, shall we do this, and can we do it? So it's a really good testing bed, and I'm sure Sam will actually say a little bit about that later on. So in summary then, what have we got available? We've mentioned electric. Electric's got some options and some opportunities, but it's got some limitations as well. I'll mention them in the next slide finally. Biomethane, which is really upgraded biogas into biomethane or grid quality biogas, which is already out there. The biomethane is there. The biogas engine technology is there. So there's a solution straight away, which could be looked at, particularly on farm situations. So we have this farm as a power station. And, of course, hydrogen that Angie mentioned earlier on. It's not far off. The challenge is going to be, once hydrogen is produced, hopefully green hydrogen, that means electrolysis of water in particular. So every wind turbine that comes in off the North Sea could go through an electrolyser and actually produce, therefore, green hydrogen straight away, if that's the best way. Or, of course, what will normally happen, it'll go into the grid straight away as electricity. But nevertheless, the opportunity to produce hydrogen is going to increase and increase. My question is, when it's increased at a scale large enough, will it actually go into transport? I suggest probably not. I suggest it'll go into the heavy industries that need a replacement for fossil fuels, and therefore hydrogen will be accepted by them, and it'll all be swept up by that case. So therefore, the only opportunity for hydrogen probably is at smaller scale. You mentioned about having on-farm electrolysis. So what a wonderful way. We said it in 2014 on the thing. Yeah. The 2014 said basically you can actually produce your renewable energy through wind and through solar. You can then store it by using electrolysis as hydrogen, and then you can reconstitute that back again to produce power, or of course you can actually use it as a fuel cell in a tractor or whatever there. I'm going to move to the last one just to give some illustration there. Battery tractors are limited by sheer weight to power, and therefore anything over 50 horsepower is unlikely to be a pure battery tractor. John Deere have produced a couple of prototypes, but it's unlikely. So horticulture, smaller scale stuff is going to be the answer for that. When you get into the, for example, the hydrogen there, you can see JCB. They've introduced a really interesting concept, and that is to say, well, rather than going all the whole way to fuel cells and all the issues that has in terms of rare metals and things like that, they've produced a hydrogen-driven internal combustion engine. So it's the same technology as a diesel ICE engine, but actually now using it as hydrogen and producing green hydrogen through electrolysis. So watch that space on that one there. And, of course, the biomethane tractor is now available. You can buy one of those now, but, again, it's a question of supply and demand, particularly of the biomethane. What is particularly important, and my finishing statement, Richard, here is on the bottom line, if we've got the technologies of the future, we do not need to have 400, 500, 600 horsepower tractors continually being developed on our farms. Yes, there'll always be a case for something on a large estate somewhere to get that through, and I've seen them in Ukraine and Russia, for example, where you've got fields which are almost as big as England. It seems to be a single field kind of situation. But in our situation, we should be looking more at the smaller, lighter, smarter technologies. And that's going to be the future. So we don't simply just blast everything with weight and power and waste all the fossil fuels. It's going to be the smart solutions that happen. And you can see a couple of examples there of the robotics there, the drone, and of course the agrobot, which leads me very nicely then to talk about one of those examples, which I think is a small robot company. Thank you.
Mike, thanks very much. Our next speaker is Vicki Hurd from Sustain, who was a contributor to the report and is continually challenging the industry and policymakers with what they need to do to deliver the type of future activity that we need. So over to Vicki. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for asking me to write the chapter. And I know this is possibly the least exciting part of it, because the tech is great and it's future thinking, and not all policy is as exciting or future thinking, I think, in that way. So yes, I'm the head of farming at Sustain, which is an alliance of about over 100 non-governmental organisations, research institutes, royal societies, and that. So we're very interested in the whole system. We see it, and we were very excited about the National Food Strategy, which was mentioned, and very disappointed in the final outcome, because it didn't look at the whole system and link it all together, nor did it link all the departments who work on food, which is most government departments in some way affect our food system and farmers. So we're disappointed with that. But some of it is not disappointing. And I'll just touch on the good news developments. I thought about putting the bad news developments first, because I don't like to end on bad news, but I have to talk about it in a particularly linear way. Obviously, Groundswell, or the great work that farmers are doing, really, really useful, and should be supported by new government research and on-farm research money. We've got to fight for that. We've got to demand that it's done in a way which is really useful. It's not really difficult. It's not all sucked into huge amounts of core university. University is great, but they're very expensive. It's got to be farmer-led. And so we're very keen on those new funds that have been announced. Very complex load of different funds with different names, but they are there, so they need to be used, because otherwise they'll be taken away by the Treasury. ELMS is obviously something that we would say is, it's revolutionary in a way. I know Victoria Prentice, when she goes abroad to meetings, the farm minister, all the ministers are saying, how's it going? How's your revolution going? The environmental land management schemes, the payment of farmers for public goods. How's it linking with private goods? How's it linking with blended finance from non-public finance? How's it going? And she, so she's standing there sort of and say it's going brilliantly. And some of it is, I've been on the engagement group since the beginning. So I've been watching how it's developed since Brexit, since we knew we had to have a new replacement cap scheme and replacing BPS. And we're going to have it launched in the next few weeks, and you'll probably hear that from Eustace this afternoon. The very first iteration for all farmers in receipt of BPS will be able to go to access 4 schemes, 2 of which are around soils. Fantastic. How great is that soils is a focus? But there's more, and I've tried to add them up, but it's slightly unclear, but it's potentially about 16 different standards. And obviously I'm talking about England at the moment. There's great stuff going on in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, different schemes. But the England ones, are potentially so many, you'll have to stack them all up on farm to get the full whack of finance for the public goods that you can provide through the assets on your farm. And I've listed a few here. Some are not 100% definite. We're definitely getting an IPM one, nutrient standards one, hedgerows, agroforestry, which is really great that's in there. That took a lot of work to get that in there. But this is all positive and can help you provide the public goods and a viable farm system. Because I understand the farms can't be in the red, but green if they're in the red. Also, we would say the vice versa is true. You can't have a viable, sustainable, resilient farm unless you're protecting the natural assets that help you farm. And can actually help you reduce costs on farm. So the natural predators, the way in nutrient cycling through using livestock. I can't name them all here, but the elms could, in theory, help you save money, also giving you money. And that's the nirvana, and I hope they'll achieve it. We've also got the Agricultural Transition Plan, the ATP, which it's got a lot of money behind it, probably not enough, but it's going to, as I said, provide for innovation, providing you with potential resources to do added value so that you can take more from your produce, from the value chain, so you get more money for what you're doing by adding value. And it could be doing it in a collaboration with other farmers, so you collaborate to get a piece of kit which will allow you to do some part processing, so you get more of the money that the final consumer pays. And there should be a new focus on land use. There should have been land use management plans in elms. May happen. But what was announced last week was a focus on land use framework, a new land use framework, which is land is it. It's everything. We need this, but it's incredibly political. It's more political than possibly anything else in society. So I heard Victoria Prentice talking about it last week, saying it's going to be very light touch. Whether light touch will mean anything, whether it'll do anything, but it's exciting that we're actually focusing on land use and on soil. And there's obviously a lot more interest in better food trading systems, more localised. That's something we're working on a lot to allow farmers to get access to markets which are close to them, and get more reward from the marketplace by adding value. We've got loads of reports on that, but I haven't got time to talk about it. But the growth of the Better Food Traders Network, that's what BFT, sorry about the acronym. But I just heard recently that the Welsh Government has just invested in 5 hubs for Wales. That will allow farmers to collate their resources, market together, and sell with a greater part of the pound going to them. That's really brilliant. We want the English government to do that, happening in Wales. And recognition in the Agricultural Act and globally of the benefits of agroecological approaches and transitions. I don't have time to talk about that, but I think that's very welcome because it's about the system, the whole farm system. That's what's needed. There's a slight disappointment with ELMS that it's focused on individual assets, assets like your pest management or your watercourse. And actually, it's the whole system needs to work together. I'm sure a lot you all know that. You're here. That's what we're about. But going on to the bad news developments, I'll go very quickly because I don't want to be too negative. But we know that there's not enough money there to deliver all the public goods, the scale of need that is there to protect the watercourses, the soil, to make farmers more resilient against the climate and nature emergency, to ensure we can feed ourselves. So collectively, as an alliance, as a group of NGOs and public interest organisations, we're going to lobby for more. We know more is needed. And this is money that will allow that transition to work. For us as consumers, for us as citizens, and for you as farmers, it's absolutely essential. So we should all be demanding that together. It's very hard to demand more money, but what's more important than food and our environment? And the budget is precarious. It's only up to the next election, and there's not enough evidence gathering, I worry about. If we don't have the evidence, the Treasury will take the money back. I say you're not delivering. So we need to be, both as farmers, being able to help with the evidence gathering, but the government need to be providing the tools to do that. And I've already mentioned whole farm systems approaches, not fade enough. I actually think, if I was thinking more into the future, that they will be doing this. It just makes so much sense. It's so much complex to stack up pieces of paper, schemes and forms, and why not do it in a whole farm way? So you have a plan, you get paid for the different things on your farm that you're doing, but you don't have to apply for 16 different standards. I think the whole system approach will come in 2030. There's a prediction. So just finishing off complexity, I think there's not enough advice and training, although that's getting better. There's a lot more, but I think there needs to be a big investment in training on agroecological approaches. Small farms, we're fighting hard to have a specific way in which to support small farms through this process, because inevitably a lot of it is based on how big you are, because that's the assets you can provide, but small farms really lose out. Also the EU market, obviously these are big things, seriously threatening things, new trade deals. I work on that quite a bit, and I haven't got time to talk about it, but that's a huge threat. No food standards, no core standards, although they were sort of announced last week in the National Food Strategy, but I don't believe it. We should be asking George Eustace this afternoon about that. Carbon offsetting, tree planting, bioenergy, all going to be using a lot of land, which may or may not be a good thing, but we need to understand what that means for our ability to feed ourselves and to protect the natural resources, and to do those carbon and environmental offsets well, if they have to be done at all, they should link in with the farming system. We've had unbelievably glacial progress on the fair dealing regulations. I fought hard to get fair dealing into the Agriculture Act 2020, and it's in there. It's a clause. Unfortunately, it's not a duty. They can do it if they want. So George Eustace is doing it very slowly. We'll probably get a dairy supply code, legally binding supply code of practice for the supply chain in between the farmer and the retailer. We already have codes for the retail end, but it's the bit in the middle that needs to be ensure that we're not getting abuse of farmers and growers. And we might get a dairy one, God knows when. I've seen a version. It wasn't good enough, too many flexibilities in it. But what about all the other sectors? And so that, for me, is a real failing. And so by 2030, hopefully all sectors will be covered by codes of practice that really ensure that we're driving up standards in terms of the deal that you'll get from your buyer. And we now have, the current state, food price inflation, all the fertiliser costs, the big labour issues. We're going to have to get better at dealing with workers and labour. But that comes from the price, the way in which the deal happens and the price that you get. I'm very aware of that. So that's got to change. One of the things we're doing about that is trying to build alternative routes to market so you get more of the food pound, so you can pay your workers well, treat them decently. I'm sure you will do, but it's very hard when you're getting squeezed all the time, ever harder, and that's particularly true in horticulture. And finally, obviously, the big problem. We need change faster. And quite a few of the talks of yesterday have been talking about 1.5 degrees rise is going to be catastrophic. We're in an island, but we're relying very much on the Gulf Stream, for our nice climate, for the water that we have. It's catastrophic if we go to 2 degrees. We've got to be more resilient. Our policy has to build resilience in every farm across the country. And I'm positive, I think it will. There's a huge nervousness about BPS cuts, quite rightly. And, I sometimes argue that I do argue that it should be emergency payments for farms in the next few months, possibly years, but not taking away from the budget for the environmental land management, the transition, and all those innovative things that are needed in place, which you're just about to hear about. They're actually helping farmers. But if we've got disaster, we don't want to lose farmers. No farm left behind, I say. And so there needs to be possibly emergency funds as things get really tight with the input costs. But we should carry on the transition for the environmental land management schemes. Thank you.
Thanks, Vicki. As provocative as ever. And that's why we got you to write a section of the report. Now we move on to the technology side. It would be nice to have featured 4 or 5 of the companies who we've contributed to the RASC Farm of the Future report. But one that stands out in particular is a small robot company, a British company developing amazing technology in Wiltshire. And I think I'll just hand over to Sam, who will just tell us a bit about the small robot company.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you very much for the invitation. We're really pleased to be featured in the report, and I'm very pleased to be back here at Groundswell for our 4th time. Lots of interesting stuff in those presentations, and the thing that really stood out for me is that these new technologies coming in have to be farmer led. And that's what we've tried really hard to be from the start. Farmers have been our advisors. They've helped to design our robots. They are shareholders in our company. We've got over 300 farmer investors. So as we grow and hopefully become the success that we want to be, farmers will benefit from the upside of that. And then of course they also become customers as well. And so we're really excited to be launching the next phase of our commercialization here at Groundswell alongside Tuckwells. So I'm going to make some general comments first of all about the direction of the industry in this space and where the 4th agricultural revolution is coming, and then talk in particular about some of the innovations that we've started to bring into the industry. So first of all, the 4th agricultural revolution, it's previously often been talked about as something that's in the distant future, but it's really not. It is something that is commercializing today. There are lots of companies out there. We're doing some interesting things. There are lots of other companies doing really exciting things. Farmers are truly becoming customers for these technologies, and it is commercializing today. The key thing is to focus on the outcomes, I think, when farmers are looking at these technologies. What are the outcomes that you need to see for your farm? There are lots we could choose here, but the ones I'm going to pick out are, firstly, better decision making. I think all of these technologies have to enable farmers to take better decisions. The second thing is more accurate action. So it is the ability to move away from blanket applications to actually precisely applying anything that we put into our field. The third thing is, of course, farmers need to come out of the red, they need to get into the black. So it needs to make farms more profitable. It can't just be about transferring cash from one solution, using manual labor to do something, to a robot to do something. That doesn't really drive the farm forward enough, I don't think. It has to increase profitability. And then, of course, the final thing is better environmental outcomes. And these technologies have huge potential, but that has to be a key measurement on whether they're going to actually be useful and stick around for the long term. So the key thing, I come from a company called Small Robot Company. I'm going to show you some slides of different robots from the industry. But actually, it's artificial intelligence that I think is the key technology that needs to be considered in all sorts of different spaces, but in particular, the growing of crops. And so these technologies are about how do we employ artificial intelligence to its maximum potential to really shape how we're going to grow our produce in the future, and to really move us from the third agricultural revolution towards the fourth agricultural revolution. Some key things to look out for. Sooner than you think, I think it's going to be unusual for a farmer to take any decision about anything that happens in their field without the support of artificial intelligence. You look as an example of how this is happening in other industries. Look at medicine, particularly in the US. There are many examples where doctors will not take a decision without the support of artificial intelligence to support their diagnosis in some way. I think that's a really good leading indicator for where farming will go. And the second thing is that it'll feel very unusual and even wrong to apply blanket applications of anything onto your fields. We're going to look back on this era where we have just blanket applied inputs as a crazy time in farming. And we're going to move towards applying things much, much more accurately. Indeed, the farming system that we are pointing towards is per-plant farming. So this is the ability to individually identify every single plant in a field, and I mean every single plant in a field, both the crop or a weed, and then to take action at that same level of detail. So not only are you identifying and locating an individual plant, you then have the ability to return to that previously identified plant. Then you're either gathering more data on it, or you are taking a really accurate action. So let me, first of all, talk about some of the other robots that are coming into the industry, and then I'll show you a little bit more about what we're doing. So Farm Droid in the top right-hand corner there, very interesting technology that's going out and drilling crops, and then once it knows exactly where that crop is, it will then go out and mechanically weed around that crop. So it's basically, we know where the crops are, and then we're just going to weed everything else. Commercializing today, several UK farmers own one of these now, and that's they're going really well. Nio in the bottom right-hand corner, that is from France originally, but very much international now. They are also doing mechanical weeding. Particularly, they've focused on higher value crops. And you can see them there, I think, in a lettuce farm. And then in the bottom left-hand corner, Carbon Robotics, based just outside Seattle. They're doing laser weeding in onions, and onions is a great first use case for this. Lots of active ingredients disappearing from the onion industry, and they're really starting to fly. An interesting point about people coming from outside the industry, founded by a couple of people from Tesla, and then they've very much pulled from Silicon Valley towards, from people who've had nothing to do with farming towards food production and robotics being an interesting thing to focus on. And then finally, of course, Small Robot Company, which I think you'll agree has got the best looking robot out of all of them, and I would argue also potentially the most useful. So what we said was per plant intelligence and per plant action lead to the outcomes that we're after. So here you can see video of our Tom robot going out scanning a field in Hampshire. You can see that we're operating in wheat here, but very much starting to gather data in other crops. And really the technology that we're building is going to be crop agnostic. It is just about gathering data and then training new models on these crops. So what the Tom robot is doing here is it is scanning the field. By that we mean that it is identifying individual weeds in the field, and it is also counting the plants in a very exact way. So we literally know exactly how many plants there are in that field, and then we can break that down into a per square metre basis. And then we're doing things like biomass assessment and leaf colour analysis, so that we're starting to influence herbicide decisions and fertiliser decisions. So if you look at this map now, you can see that the lighter green hexagons there are where a weed has been identified. You can see the point cloud there. You click onto it, and there is a JPEG of the individual weed that has been identified. And so this was done on a scan in March in Suffolk. So this is weeds being identified in the growing crop. And we individually identified, I think it says, I can't quite read, 1,722 weeds in this 14-hectare field. We then converted that into a shapefile that talks to the sprayer. And this is very much a standard shapefile format. So any modern sprayer will be able to apply this. The sprayer then goes through the field and only applies the herbicide where the weeds are. So remember what I said at the start. It's using artificial intelligence to make better decisions. So they're using AI. They're making a better decision around where they're going to apply their herbicides. It is more accurate action because they're only applying that herbicide. They're only applying that herbicide where the weeds are. It is increasing profitability for the farmer. In that instance, they used 3% of the herbicide that they would have used. They saved 97% of their herbicides. We said, typically we think it's going to be more in the sort of 70 to 80% range. But in that instance, yeah, they saved 97% of their herbicides. And then, of course, it's better outcomes for the environment. We're using less chemicals. It's better for the soil. There's less pollution. All of those things. And then how does this develop into the next iteration? How does it develop into other crops? What we're really building here is a modular system that can be varied to suit individual crops. And this is what I mean by crop agnostic. We can vary the width. We can also vary the height of these robots. That's set up for non-chemical weeding, so zapping individual weeds potentially with electricity, but it could be anything. It could be micro-spraying, micro-dosing nutrients. It could be scanning, and then you can build these robots out so that you have multiple holes, and you're increasing the scale, increasing the speed with which these things are operating. And with that, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sam. That was absolutely inspiring and great to see technology being developed by farmers, for farmers, that is actually world-leading. So we've got a little bit of time left for questions and comments. So I'll hand over to our roving mic, and please ask your questions or add your comments. See hands go up. Start with the gentleman at the front here.
Been talking about carbon, but you haven't been talking about methane. I appreciate many people here are running livestock on arable systems with relatively low daily live weight gains. And my big concern is that we're going to have almost like a methane explosion from especially cattle more so than sheep. Do the panel have any concerns regarding that? And methane is potentially a quick win in efficiency gains for greenhouse gas emissions.
Angie.
To me, this is an engineering problem. I mean, I've run smaller digesters, to be fair, in the middle of London, and it's an engineering problem, and you just have to be mindful of the safety. I mean, farmers have always dealt with methane in terms of pits under cattle and pumping and mixing that stuff. What we will be seeing is that slurry stores will have to be covered, increasingly, and therefore gases will have to be captured and dealt with. So this is just a problem for livestock farmers, particularly cattle, beef and dairy, that will have to be dealt with. So it's an engineering problem.
Vicki, do you want to add anything?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously it's a really potent greenhouse gas, and we need to be minimising emissions. But the biggest emissions, obviously, from the fossil fuel industry, from methane, from power production. But I think that, you say there's solutions. What I guess we might be concerned with if those solutions involve changing the way in which livestock, or enhancing the way in which livestock are kept, entirely housed, and that worries me, because there are big implications for animal health and welfare in fully housed systems that need to be put into the equation and talked about. But there are going to be new grants for slurry storage. I think they're already been announced, so farmers will get help for that. But I think we need to, again, look at it in the round, think about animal welfare, and possibly we are advocating less and better meat, controversially, in our organisation, but very much about good meat being produced, and that might be part of the solution.
I think it's one of the few positive outcomes of COP26 was the reference to methane and methane management, and diet, and the feed companies need to be looking at formulation of diets and things like that.
It's about on the land, actually grazing livestock. So my concern was about going more extensive in grazing livestock, and I suggested in Bristol one day what we should have is atmospheric beef, which basically means most of the beef comes as a co-product of the dairy system. We use sexed semen, and so we optimise every calf born, because it's 70% less methane output than circular cow systems.
I think I'd refer you to the livestock report in the Farm of the Future documentation, written by Jude Capper from Harper Adams, and there's a lot of interesting stuff on there on methane. Next question, gentleman at the front here.
When we were talking about biomethane, I think one of the easy wins is going to be carbon dioxide capture and storage. Because when you're making biomethane, you're intrinsically separating the CO2 out rather than any other carbon capture, which is a lot more expensive. You've already got there.
Mike, do you want to? Yeah.
That's interesting, Stephen. Using biomethane as an asset and as a resource rather than as a problem, and I think I've been brought up on a dairy farm all my life, and it's always been a problem. Suddenly we can start to say, well, it's got multi-benefits. The upgrading of, some of you will know, the upgrading of biogas, which is straight off the slurry pit, if you like, into biomethane. It's been around now for probably 10 years, I suppose, in that regard. So the idea, this idea of a kind of closed-loop system that says, right, you've got your slurry, you've got your biogas, you upgrade it to biomethane, and you put it in your tractor, seems just such an obvious loop. There are pieces missing, and the biomethane tractor has been missing, of course, in that system as well. But I think your idea of being able to then help in the carbon capture is a really interesting one that I'm not sure whether we really covered in a report, but it's certainly something that needs that profile, particularly with carbon capture.
And did you want to add anything?
I was going to say there's two elements to that. One is I think a lot of some of the stuff that Vicki talks about is that a lot of our food systems is in the hands of a number of small people, and a small number of people control it. And carbon dioxide is no exception. So food-grade carbon dioxide is produced from fossil fuels by a very small number of companies. So our supply chain is not very resilient, and therefore having a source like that is hugely important. But then what we also see coming along is the ability to inject hydrogen into that digester, which biologically is an easy thing to do. And actually what you're doing is you're maximizing the energy value of the carbon in the digester, which leads to less land use for anything, and also optimizes the carbon that we are producing.
I think it's important to recognize that as a farmer, you can supply carbon dioxide, you can supply fuel, you can supply energy, you can supply the electricity to run the small robot on. But at the moment, carbon capture is happening at a large scale. So the Brewdog plant that I've been involved in and we showed earlier, they're capturing their carbon, and that's going to replace imported carbon going into their brewery. The challenge, as ever, is to get this to happen at a small scale so that it can happen on farm. But it will come. Do we have another question? And hands up if you've got a... One here. Yep.
Thank you. I just wondered if there's any work being done on producing nitrogen fertiliser on farm by electrolysis of water and creating nitrogen.
It's kind of a way out in left field question. There is a lot of work being done, whether it's at farm scale or commercial readiness now is because, and I think the reason for that is the ammonia as a fuel option. So yes, I'm no expert, but I would say that there is quite a bit of work being done for exactly the reasons that you talk about.
I'm just going to take the chairman's prerogative and ask the question myself. Oh, sorry, Vicki, go on.
I was just going to say, there's a very good article on the Sustainable Food Trust website about using hydrogen to produce fertilisers, the pros and cons, and it's very useful and good references because it is a big area to look at as well.
We're due to be drawing to a close, but as it's raining, we might be able to sneak in a few more questions because one of the people may not want to rush off. So, are there any more questions out there before I perhaps pick gentlemen? Two over there.
Good morning. I had a question about the progression of robotics, because obviously a big emphasis of regenerative farming is cover cropping, intercropping, undersowing, and it doesn't currently feel like robotics can kind of cope yet with those complex systems. How far away in the future would you see robotics being able to kind of help manage kind of the height of an undersown cover crop or something like that to make that sort of full field cover more feasible and practical for farmers?
So I think that we're probably 12 months to 24 months away from a robot being able to go through a cover crop and individually identify every single species in that cover crop. So that'll be a first step towards something that is useful. And I think that the next step after that would be to be able to selectively take things, because you want to keep some of those things in place as you drill the next crop, but take some of them out. And yeah, you're probably in a sort of a 2 to 3 year window from that. This is really starting to accelerate. But I would say that it's for a long time. It's going to have to work in unison with other farm machines. I don't think that the robots will necessarily solve everything, but I think they can. The outcomes that I was talking about, better decision making. What's the right time to take this cover crop out? Which particular plants in this crop do I want to take out? Which do I want to leave in place? And doing that in a way that's profitable and moving us away from the blanket application again of herbicides to achieve that. I think it's going to happen pretty quickly.
Yes, I'd also say the speed of transition of technology it staggers me. Having said that it's taken a long time to get from 2014 to 2022, but when you look at things now in terms of the AI particularly, 3 years ago I didn't know what AI was, apart from cattle semen, of course. But now, we all seem to. My son works in AI. I still don't understand what he does, but he works in AI. And I think we're at a paradigm shift time now, because it's a bringing in of transfer of technology from other sectors, as I explained before. One of the things I just wanted to mention, though, is that you've got to have all the infrastructure in there. And I've discussed this with Sam already, that if you're going to have systems which are digitally based and require connectivity and bandwidth, then some of us know that in our rural areas we're not that 2Gs, if you're lucky, let alone 4G or 5G. And I think there are some solutions out there starting to happen which have come from different sectors, like the army in Afghanistan, for example, who have had to communicate. Once we start transferring that technology into farming, it can happen very quickly. And I'm very excited about the situation. I think that's why 2030, when we originally started about saying 2030 is a long way off, it's only, 7.5 years off now. But in that time, we're going to see significant change, and it's that scaling up that you were mentioning there. It'll happen sooner than we think because of the new things that are coming into the industry from outside and the transfer of technology. But we've got to get that broadband access everywhere available for us all.
We had one more question, and then we'll wrap up.
Hiya. Going back to the first point of this discussion, in terms of on-farm power generation to decarbonise rural communities, what do you think is the most appropriate renewable strategy or is it a combination of everything?
That's a great question because it is integration, no doubt about it. We were involved since 2006 in things like solar and wind, and then along came the concept of electric vehicles, and then on came the concept of battery storage, and then on came the concept of hydrogen potentially through electrolysis. When you start looking at all these together, you can see it's integrated solutions which are the answer. And behind all that is data again. It's the control, the smartness, the smart farm, which is the future. So what also we've got to keep in mind, our work on solar has slowed right down, understandably, since feed-in tariff stopped in 2019. But the last 3 months, what a surprise, the phone rings now. And I was at a factory in Birmingham who used 1.3 million kilowatt hours of electricity a year, metal plating, for example. Their April bill, they came in on the daytime, not the nighttime, but the daytime cost was 14.5p a kilowatt hour. And he just brought me in the May bill on Monday, and it was 31.5p per kilowatt hour. And that's on 1.3 million kilowatt hours used in the year. Now, I suggest that some farms have got quite high electricity bills, some haven't. But that is suddenly a huge trigger there that gets people going and saying, right, what can we do? So the phone rings up, and many of my farmer friends will say, what do we look at next? And it's not one single solution. It's about an integrated set of things which suits that particular farm. The idea of producing electricity to sell back to the grid, don't go there. It doesn't pay. It doesn't stack up. It's about balancing your supply and demand in that particular farm or factory or whatever, which is important. What can you use? So integration is the key.
Andy, do you want to add anything? I just say we'll give each of the panel a chance to say a few final words, and then I'll wrap up.
I don't really have anything to add to that other than the fact that it is very much a horses for courses in terms of, if you're looking at your carbon footprint, that energy exercise is part of that, and you have to cut your cloth accordingly.
Vicki, you want anything to add generally before we wrap up?
Yeah, I would say just make sure you get involved in the government schemes. Make demands and make more demands. And I know it's very frustrating. The last thing you probably want is more government intervention. But by 27, you'll have no BPS. So make sure you can access that and support the development. So those co-created schemes are genuinely co-created in your interest. So they actually deliver for you as well as public goods.
Sam?
I'll just go for a shameless plug in typical startup fashion. We're doing a demo up in the demo tent at 10:30, and then shortly followed, because it's not really space to do a proper demo in the demo tent. Shortly followed by a real demo down just in the area just by the Tuckwell stand to our right here, which will be at 11 or just before. So if you're interested in seeing it working in real life, then please come.
My final comment is keep optimistic. It's a great future. It really is exciting. I wish I was starting again.
Just to wrap up, I just want to mention there are actually 2 report authors in the room who haven't contributed today. And if they'd like to step up, Nigel Davis, if you'd just like to show where you are. If anybody wants to talk about decarbonising cereal production. And then Jonathan Wheeler, who was an excellent contributor to our decarbonising farm vehicles report. So they're here to answer questions if anybody wants to talk to them after the event. It stopped raining, so we probably better stop. Just a few things to just say at the end. It's about a spectrum of farms and a spectrum of activities and a spectrum of technologies. There will never be a one-size-fits-all. And as an ex-government advisor myself, I worry that we are going to be boxed into schemes by government which limit the flexibility of individual farmers. It's about AI and broadband and reach into the farming communities. It's about the future of the internal combustion engine. It's been written off by policymakers. It's going to be here way beyond 2050, but not fueled by diesel. As Mike talked about, it's going to be fused by gas fuels, whether it's hydrogen, nitrogen, and perhaps initially biomethane. And I think the key thing that RESE is going to be looking at as it rolls out the sort of follow-up to the report is dissemination. How do we get information out to farmers on farms? Groundswell is a great event. It'd be nice to see, a Groundswell of the North or a Scottish Groundswell, but equally we need on-farm demonstration sites. It's great that that's happening in Wales. DEFRA need to dig into their pockets and help it happen in the UK. Some of you, well, all of you should have on your seat one of these cards. It gives you it's got a code on the back, so you can literally click on that and get it up onto your handheld device. It's also on the RESE website. We hope it's of interest, but the future is about breaking it down into bite-sized chunks and getting information out to farmers, and that's what IFA is very good at. So hopefully that'll be happening in the future. But thank you all for coming today. Thank you, and thank you to our speakers.